So I received this question from Mark via Facebook, and it reads, "What EQs do you use most?" And to answer that question, the best way to, there's the way I use an EQ is I've got certain EQs that are for certain things. For instance, FabFilter Pro Q3, I use that a lot as my kind of, I use that as a detailed surgical EQ. It's got the spectrum analyzer built into it. It is a Swiss Army knife of EQ. It does mid side. It does left processing on the left. You can do different processing on the right. It does everything. Dynamic EQ. It literally does everything. So the FabFilter Pro Q3 covers a broad range of various things that you need from an EQ. So that is my number one EQ that just does everything to a really, really good level. It's not like it's not an EQ that you're going to go, right, I'm going to add this EQ to get a lovely thick rich texture down in the bottom end. It's not going to do that. It's really clean. It just does a very, very surgical job. It does everything that you want it to do. That's what it does. To a really, really, really high level. I tend to use the FabFilter Pro Q3 on the on the end of pretty much every channel, just because I like to use the spectrum analyzer to see the frequency range of every single sound. So I'll have one on pretty much every single channel. And I can do any roll offs, anything like that. Anything I need to roll out the filter out the low end rumble, do that. Same with the high. Any slight EQ adjustments that need to be done on each channel is generally done on the Pro Q3 because it has. The reason I use it on every channel is because it can do everything I need it to do on every channel. So it's just one plugin that does everything. Then we go into EQs that add a little bit more character. And the one that I'm using a lot at the moment is on the UAD platform, and it is the Chandler Curve Bender. And I'm using that more at the moment as a more coloured sound. So it's giving me a lovely coloured sound. It's a fairly good emulation of the hardware, and the hardware, it's a nice hardware unit. I actually personally prefer the plugin to the hardware. I don't own the hardware. I've used the hardware. I've compared the two, and I mean, I do in a way compare. I do in a way prefer the plugin, and it's not massively CPU hungry on the UAD chips, and it's a great sounding EQ. It's a very, very good sounding EQ, and I'm using that a lot at the moment. And it also has mid side, which is great because I can, and you've got the left and right and the stereo link. So there's a lot of really good features that it has. High, low shelves, which are switchable to bells. What's great about it is I've got the S4 behind me, so I can map it really, really well, and it does map really good onto the S4, onto this section here. And I can get some real good control of it. Literally, you can control every single feature that is available on that EQ. You can do. The other EQs that I use in terms of channel strip, I use the SSL Native a lot, and I use that. I find that's the best SSL channel strip going. It's the most accurate. And which it's that's understandable. The SSL bring out the most accurate version of their hardware in plugin format. The EQ on the channel strip is really good. Also, obviously, you've got the filters, you've got the compressor and the gate and everything in that whole channel strip as well. So it does double up as a full channel strip. I use that a lot, and you've got also brown and black knobs, which are switchable on there. So you've got that feature, and it is a great sounding EQ. I do use that a lot. That's my kind of, if I'm looking on each channel and I'm looking to just throw a channel strip on, I will put the SSL native. It's quite low CPU usage as well, which is great. Right, also as well, Dangerous Backs EQ. Now the Dangerous Backs EQ I use a lot, and that is because it does my high and low shelves. So you've got basically a Backs EQ. You're talking about just your high and low shelf. You've got nothing in the mids, just high and low. You've got shelves and roll off, and it's just a case of shaping the low end, shaping the top end, and it's a very simple EQ design that it has a purpose, and that purpose is to shape your low end or shape your high end. The other one that I use a lot is the SSL Fusion, the SSL Violet EQ from the Fusion, and that's a very good EQ, very similar to the Backs EQ, without the high frequency roll off. So you don't have the high roll off, but you do have a low roll off, and you have a low end gain and frequency adjuster, and then also you have the high frequency, which you have frequency band select. You also have on that one, you have a fat button, and the fat button makes the low end fat. It's quite useful, this fat button. I tend to not really like things that just are a button that says fat. I tend not to like a button. If it's one knob or a button that just kind of goes and adds something, I like a bit more control over that, especially a button, because a button is like a on and off. Whereas a knob is a gradual amount, so you can adjust how much of, let's call it, fat goes in. Whereas the SSL fat button is just a button that kind of goes fat on or fat off, and it does add a little bit. It adds a bit of weight to that low end, and it does sound quite cool. I tend not to use it that much. But the EQ as a Violet EQ, it's a lovely sounding EQ. And what I've always said about the Fusion EQ, the Violet EQ built into the Fusion, is you can actually drive that quite a lot. You can turn that up to +9 in the highs, and it doesn't sound harsh. It doesn't sound like it's too much. I guess it's quite a passive EQ, and it's a lovely sounding EQ. What else? What other EQs do I use a lot? Here's another good one. And this one I recently bought from Eventide, and it's called Split EQ. A Split EQ splits dynamics and tonal EQ. And the two work incredibly well together. I was quite taken aback when I first tried this. For me, it works incredibly well on kick drums. Really well, and the reason for that is you can find the sweet spot in the kick, that body and that weight that you want from that kick, so it pumps, and you can use the tonal and transients independently of each other to really kind of pick out that transient punch that you want, and pull that out, and then add tonal weight to it. And the two, I mean, you can literally add this thing to a kick drum and bypass in and out, and it's like, whoa, that is really changing the sound in a really positive way. Like, so much so that it pretty much, I would say 80% of the time, maybe probably 90, 9 out of 10 times, that EQ is always going onto a kick because it's incredibly good. Snare drums pulling out that punch in the low end of the snare drum. That it's really good for things like that. Removing some dynamic kind of peaks on things like hi-hats, making hi-hats a bit more smoother, but then pulling the EQ out of it is really cool. There's a lot of really, really useful ways to use that, and it's in mastering as well. It's a little bit like it can save you sometimes because there's certain things, mix errors that are done in the mix. Let's say, for instance, in the mix, we've got a snare that's a bit too quiet, and all we have is a stereo file, and we have to bring it out in the master. So split EQ, we can actually kind of get the snare from within the track and pull it out without pulling everything else out. And we can isolate that snare, and we can really we can actually find certain sounds in a mix and pull them out and just pull that sound out. And if you were using, let's say, FabFilter Pro Q3, you wouldn't achieve the same results. You don't achieve the same results, and it's for certain little things like that it's a brilliant EQ for. Can I think of any other EQs that I use? God, EQ wise, that is pretty much that's basically all the EQs that I use. Actually, there's one more that I will add, and it's a, you could call it an EQ, but it's more classed as a bass resonance tool, and that is the UAD Little Labs Vogue. Now that's a really, really good EQ. I don't know whether you'd class it as an EQ because it's a very particular EQ. Basically, what it does is it adds weight, it adds body, it adds low bass resonance to a sound. Majority of the time, you will use it on kick drums. You will use it on a bass. Anything with a low kind of sub range, you want to be using it on. There's not a great deal to say about that. It's literally an amplitude and a frequency that you change, give it more amplitude, and then find the frequency, which is the sweet spot. And it gives your, for instance, a kick a lot of weight. It gives it that real nice body. Yeah, that is basically all the EQs that I use religiously at the moment. They are the EQs that I I use in every mix, that always go into the mix. Obviously, sometimes you'll find there's other EQs that you'll go to certain EQs for a certain kind of sound. And I mean, when I've got literally probably about 100 different EQs to choose from, and they are what, the 5 or 6 EQs that I will literally go to every time as my chosen EQs, I guess. And one thing I will say regarding EQs is you can have 100 EQs, but it is better to have 5 or 6 that do specific jobs, and those EQs inside out. Yeah, and they're my EQs that do specific jobs, and they all have a certain job. So yeah, okay, that is my 5 or 6 EQs that I use day to day.